All right, welcome back to Homework 1C. There we go. Today we're going to be talking about 1.7 through 1.9. All of those topics have to do with federalism. Federalism is the sharing of power between federal and state governments. A lot of times it is represented by a Venn diagram, which is a pretty good representation of the fact that under our system of federalism, we have some powers that are federal, some powers that are state, and some powers that are shared. Okay, and so there are different types of powers. Exclusive power is only held by one level of government. And so this is going to be enumerated powers that are written down. Enumerated means written down, usually in like a list, that are in the Constitution as these are just federal powers, and we are giving them or delegating them to the states, also called enumerated powers. And these are powers that the Constitution explicitly says are just levels jobs. It can also include implied powers, especially for the federal government. This becomes relevant for things like air travel. Air travel is a federal power. There are no real state powers when it comes to air travel because it doesn't really make sense logistically and practically for states to be in charge of air travel when airplanes are often traveling internationally or between different states. And so that has become an implied power to the federal government, even though it's not in the Constitution because there were no airplanes back then. Then there are reserve powers. Reserve powers are things that are not really covered in the Constitution, or that they are explicitly given to the states. And either way, those are all state powers. So the 10th Amendment basically says that anything that is not enumerated or listed in the federal government, with some exceptions, goes to the states, right? For example, licensing, right? That is a power explicitly stated in the Constitution that is a state power. All the different types of licenses are not really explained, but it's implied in there that these are all reserved powers to the states. And then concurrent powers is that middle of the Venn diagram. They are shared. Taxation, making and enforcing laws, courts, building roads, right? And so the next thing to know about 1.7 is that it covers funding. So we call this fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism is the idea that the federal and state governments' relationships a lot of times hinge on money. And so we call this revenue sharing. Revenue sharing is actually national funding with generally no restrictions. It's more like an allowance. But some do have restrictions, and so we call those grants or mandates. And so block grants are national fundings with minimal restrictions. It's more like a blank check, right? Here, Alaska, you can have this money, use it kind of how you want. Categorical grants, on the other hand, are national funding with restrictions. So you can only use this on special education's inclusion support. You can only use this on repairing a highway. You can only use this on protecting a specific wildlife species. And so if you might be able to tell, the federal government prefers categorical grants because they can kind of control that funding and what it's used for, whereas states prefer block grants. And so there's kind of a conflict between the federal and state governments sometimes because the states want more freedom to spend the money as they need. The federal government says, you won't spend it responsibly, I'm going to help control it, and there's kind of a back and forth there. And then last thing is just note the term mandate. Mandate is just a broad term. All it means is a requirement by the national government of the states. These can be funded or unfunded. So funded mandates are when the federal government will help pay for whatever you're trying to put in place. An unfunded mandate is where they're saying, states, you have to do X, Y, Z, but we're not going to help pay for it. An example of an unfunded mandate would be Americans with Disability Act requirements. So for example, disability accessibility features in federal buildings, in state buildings. They require things like wheelchair ramps, elevators, accessible bathrooms, and that is not something the federal government pays for, but it is something they make the states do. And so that is a conflict sometimes between the federal and state governments because the federal government says, you need to do this, it's the right thing to do. The state government says, don't tell me what to do. And there's kind of a back and forth there again. Then we get into 1.8. 1.8 is constitutional interpretations of federalism. So there are 4 clauses that you really need to know here. All of them come back to the 10th Amendment. So the 10th Amendment to the Constitution is going to be really important for you to understand. The 10th Amendment basically says that all powers not explicitly delegated and given to the federal government are reserved to the state governments. And again, there are some exceptions like air travel, but generally speaking, if it's not in the Constitution as a federal power, it gives it to the states. And that is a states' rights amendment. Okay. That being said, the 14th Amendment is kind of at odds to that, because the 14th Amendment says that citizenship is equal for anyone born in America, and it gives the federal government the power to enforce protections for any person against the states. For example, if a state court rules that a discrimination action against an individual in their state by the government is allowed, the federal government can step in there at the federal level in the federal court and say, actually, no, you can't. And so there's this clause called the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. And so those two clauses give the national government the power to enforce protections. The Due Process Clause says that you have the right to a fair and speedy trial. You have the right to, all of those Fifth Amendment rights that you would have. You have the right to know the charges against you, and you have the right to, if you're being searched, have that done in a legal and safe way. And so if those rights, those Fifth Amendment due process rights, are being violated because of discrimination, the 14th Amendment allows the federal government to step in and police the states. And so that is a federalism issue, because in theory, the states should be able to do what they want. But when it comes to the 14th Amendment, the federal government has supremacy there under the Due Process Clause, as well as under the Equal Protection Clause. For example, if a state court ruled against someone because they were disabled and said, well, you're disabled, we're ruling against you because of your disability for some reason, the state government would be violating the Equal Protection Clause, and therefore the federal government would have the right to step in and police the states there. Then we have the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause gives the national government the power to regulate interstate commerce. Interstate means between two states. Intrastate means within one state. So you do need to know the difference between interstate and intrastate. Interstate, I-N-T-E-R, interstate, means between two states. So if I'm going from Texas to Colorado, right? Intrastate is within one state, Houston to Austin. The Supreme Court interpretations can influence how much this is how powerful this is, basically. But the Commerce Clause basically says that if two states are engaging in trade, that the federal government can step in and regulate that. Okay. The Necessary and Proper Clause basically gives Congress the power to make laws that are necessary and proper. I know, shocking. And basically what this says is that if the federal government needs to do a job in its enumerated powers, and to do that job, they need to do another job first that is not within their enumerated powers, they're allowed to do that. So if, A is allowed, B is in theory not allowed, but it's necessary to get A done, it's fine. It's also called the Elastic Clause because it basically stretches the power of the federal government. And it basically says that anything the federal government needs to do that is necessary, so needed, like they would get in trouble if they didn't do it, okay? And proper, so good for the people, they are generally allowed to do. Is that super broad? Yes. And so there's a lot of debate there as to what is necessary and proper. And then last, there's the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause is basically a trump card, and no pun intended. It basically says that the national government and its laws generally precede state laws, like they take precedence. So if there's a state law and a federal law that disagree, the federal wins. And so, for example, if the federal law is that marijuana is illegal, and then states legalize that drug, technically it is still illegal federally. The state law cannot override the federal law. All right, and then 1.9 basically brings up some case studies, right? And so this right here, the biggest thing to understand here is that there are a lot of different ways for people and interest groups and lobbyists, people like that, to influence policy. And so that is why federalism actually has a huge impact on policymaking. Because if I was passionate about, let's say, gun control, and I really wanted to help get a law passed about guns, for or against gun control, right? I could go to my local government, my state government, and or the federal government to be able to advocate for that, right? Or if I was passionate about the environment, right, I could help get a law passed here in Belton. I could get a law passed in Bell County, like a county ordinance. I could get a state law passed, or we could get a federal law passed. And so there are a lot of different ways for stakeholders and institutions to influence public policy through federalism. So that could look like interest groups lobbying, citizens organizing, people challenging laws in court, local governments creating or resisting laws. Sometimes that means that the federal government will pass a law and then states will kind of challenge that, say, no, actually, we're not going to be doing that. And we're not going to comply with that law because it's unconstitutional. And so then that's where the courts step in. The other thing is that there's a huge variation in policies across states, right? There are different places where different drugs are legal, right, or illegal. There are places where education varies. We in Texas take the STAR test, where that actually stands for State of Texas Assessment for Academic Readiness. So that is a Texas test. Whereas in Virginia, they take the SOLs, they don't take the STAR. So the policies are different there because education is a state power. And so national policymaking is really just limited by that sharing of concurrent powers with state governments because to an extent, the states are really who's in charge. So just be able to look at a situation, a law getting passed, someone advocating for something, a ballot initiative, a law getting challenged in court, and be able to identify how federalism impacted that situation. All right, see you later.